humans to reproduce, such as in viruses, or if they become eukaryotic themselves, such as everything in here, the fungi, the protists, and the helminths. All right. So we're going to begin with fungi and algae, right? The study of fungi is called mycology. Few fungi are pathogenic and virulent, but some are, right? The immune system usually holds off fungal invasion unless you're immunocompromised, in which case you can get an opportunistic infection. An example of that would be something like thrush, where you get white fuzz growing in your mouth and on your mucous membranes, okay? They have important symbiotic relationships with other organisms in the ecosystem. They're important, for instance, in recycling, okay? They are able to add components back to the water table and back to the atmosphere as decomposers, okay? Mycorrhizae are the fungi on the roots of plants. Incidence of fungal infection has been increasing, especially in hospital settings. So these are nosocomial infections, or in institutional settings such as nursing homes, where people have a lot of compromised immune systems, okay? Remember that as we age, our immune system becomes less effective because there's simply less cells to do the job, right, to defend us. And in people that are hospitalized, a lot of them are taking drugs that suppress immune function. Immunosuppressants and anti-inflammatories will do that, not to mention chemotherapy and radiation therapy. Fungi provide food for humans in the form of mushrooms and truffles. They're used in the manufacture of food and beverage, including breads, beer, citric acid, soy sauce, and some cheeses. Okay, so again, they're not all bad. Most of them are actually either neutral or beneficial to us. Fungi produce pharmaceuticals such as penicillin and cephalosporin. They do that naturally so that they can basically carve out an area to live where other microbes can't grow. Okay. Fungi are of use in the making of immunosuppressive drug cyclosporin for organ transplant patients, and mevinic acid, which is used in the manufacture of cholesterol-reducing drugs. They're also important in research tools in genetics and biotechnology. One of the reasons they're used in biotech a lot is because, for instance, yeast are used a lot in biotech since they are eukaryotes. And so if we're looking, for instance, at protein expression, we could use yeast as a model system because they have a rough endoplasmic reticulum, they have Golgi and all those other things that you see in other eukaryotes. So we can produce products in fungi that would operate the way they're supposed to, where in some cases we can't do that in something like bacteria, okay? Fungal colonies are vegetative. They grow as filamentous multicellular organisms forming hyphae. And the mycelia is basically a collective mass of hyphae. So like when you're walking through the park after a rain and you see a mushroom, right? That's just a tiny piece of that organism, right? Most of the organism is actually embedded in what it's growing on and running down even into the soil, okay? In fact, the largest organism on Earth by square meters and surface area is a fungus, okay, believe it or not. They can be unicellular, they can form hyphae. The mycelia is a collective mass of hyphae. Fungi are eukaryotes, but they're different from plants and animals because they grow on what they feed. Depending on environmental conditions, fungi can exhibit different shape characteristics. They can be small or huge. They're free living and heterotrophic, okay? Meaning what? They have to find energy from a carbon source, usually a dead carbon source, all right? Even though those molecules contain energy, right? They're free living, generally speaking. They appear as yeasts, molds, and fleshy fungi. They have cell walls composed of chitin, okay? Now, we talked about the cell wall earlier when we were talking about bacteria. And we noted that the cell wall, wherever you find it, is functionally identical but structurally different in each organism, right? The purpose of the cell wall is to protect against osmotic shock, right? If you threw that cell into pure water and it took up water quicker than it left, then the cell would swell up. And if there was no cell wall, the cell would rupture and die, okay? So that's always the major job of the cell wall. Here, the cell wall is made of chitin. In plants, it's made of cellulose, wood, okay? And in bacteria, it's made of peptidoglycan. And in archaea, it's made of even other things, okay? Fungi tend towards maximal growth in a somewhat low pH environment. Most are resistant to osmotic pressure, as opposed to bacteria, can grow in high concentrations of sugar or salt. They can grow on substances with low moisture content, too low to support bacterial growth, and they can metabolize more complex carbohydrates than bacteria can. They differ from plants. They don't have chlorophyll. They don't use photosynthesis. Their ribosomal RNA is ADS, and some of them make toxins like ergot alkaloids, psychotropics, and aflatoxin. Fungal pathogens can be classified on the basis of their growth forms, filamentous, yeast, or dimorphic, and on the type of infection they can cause. As an example, superficial mycosis is a fungus that grows on the surface of the skin or hair. In cutaneous and subcutaneous mycoses, nails and deeper layers of the skin are involved. And in deep mycoses, the fungus spreads to internal organs. You're only going to see that in rare cases, okay, such as in immunocompromised patients. Patients with compromised immune systems are especially susceptible to fungal infection, whereas superficial and cutaneous mycoses are generally mild, while systemic mycoses are serious and difficult to treat, okay? Now, interesting sidebar on this ergot, okay? If any of you are fans of history, okay, let's put the pen up here. Ergot, all right, makes LSD, okay, and it's thought that some of the behavior related to the Salem witch trials was due to the consumption of rye grain contaminated with ergot. Okay, so it may have been that these people consumed the ergot in the grain and then they hallucinate. Okay. And that may have been a contributing factor to the Salem witch trials. It's a theory, okay, but the conditions were ripe for ergot contamination. And of course, we know that that's one of the things that this particular fungus generates, right? And y'all have probably heard that there are psychedelic mushrooms and such, and those are the psychotropic agents that are made by those fungi. Okay? Yeast are single-celled fungi that reproduce either sexually or asexually. They reproduce asexually by budding. Some can become multicellular and connect budding cells. They're classed according to the presence or absence of a capsule, the size and shape of their cells, daughter cell formation, formation of hyphae, sexual spores, and genetic data. They may require oxygen or can grow in the absence of oxygen, okay? Pseudohyphae or true hyphae refer to the connecting budding cells. And you can see an example of yeast here, okay? This shows a single yeast cell that can reproduce by either budding, as shown in A, right? Or becoming multicellular through the formation of pseudohyphae, okay? The micrograph down there is a typical unicellular yeast culture. So, I mean, what do we have to thank yeast for? Well, beer, bread, okay, in some cases wine, all thanks to yeast and the fact that they can perform something called fermentation. Which produces alcohol and some CO2. Okay. Molds are rapidly growing. They reproduce asexually. They develop hyphae that develop characteristic culture. Generally, hyphae have cross walls and septa. You can divide hyphae into distinct unicellular cell-like units called septate hyphae. Some have coincidic hyphae, which are multicellular cells that stretch for long distances. Hyphae are long filaments of cells joined together, which result in colony characteristics that can be used for identification. and they can grow into immense proportions. Okay, so you see examples of coincidic hyphae there and septate hyphae on the left. Okay. In an appropriate environment, hyphae grow to form a mycelium. Okay, it's visible to the naked eye. You can see some examples here. Okay. Dimorphic fungi can be split into yeast and molds. Some can grow in both forms depending on temperature and are called dimorphic. As mold with septate hyphae in their natural environment at room temperature and laboratory conditions, as yeast in tissues in the laboratory at 37. Okay, and some can cause systemic mycoses. All right, systemic mycoses usually start by the inhalation of spores from the mold, and they germinate in the lungs where the fungus grows as a yeast. These fungi include sporanthrax, okay, which produces sporotrichosis, histoplasma, which produces histoplasmosis, blastomyces, which produces blastomycosis, and paracoccidioides, which produces paracoccidioid mycosis, and the rest of the coccidioides species, which produce coccidiomycosis. All fungi have some form of asexual reproduction. Most fungi can also produce sexually. This introduces variation into the population and allows them to respond to evolution and natural selection. That's important. It often occurs when the environment changes. Asexual reproduction doesn't involve genetic recombination between two sexual types, but sexual reproduction does involve genetic recombination. So a lot of these fungi can do both, all right? And remember that in sexual reproduction, always increases biodiversity. Okay, which means you're going to get more characteristics in the population than you would otherwise. And then if the environment changes, there are going to be some individuals that are going to be able to resist that change and have reproductive success. And that's basically how natural selection works. Okay. In asexual reproduction, yeast typically bud in a manner similar to binary fission in bacteria. Filamentous fungi reproduce by fragmentation of their hyphae and by spore formation. In asexual reproduction, we see formation of sporangia, which release the spores into the environment, and they cause infection after inhalation. Okay. Asexual reproduction is called mitosis. Asexual spores are often categorized on the basis of the nature and the manner of the spore development. So you can see some examples here, right? You've got arthrospores, right? Chlamydia spores, Bialospores, orospores, microconidia. Okay. Now, a word about the spore. Okay. The spore is like a resting state. Okay. The spore isn't going to grow until appropriate moisture and nutrient conditions are found. So this is another way for an organism to sort of become immortal, right? Once you form the spore can hang out for many, many, many years until appropriate conditions pop back up. This is why you worry, for instance, about water damage in your house, because the spores are already there in the air, and the water gives them the opportunity to go into vegetative growth, right? And release even more spores, and that can be a hazard to your health, okay? If you don't believe me, take a slice of Wonder Bread and leave it on the kitchen counter for several days, okay? And I promise you, it will turn green and fuzzy, all right? And that's a mold. That's a mold called penicillium, and it produces penicillin, believe it or not, the antibiotic that we use in hospitals, okay? We talked about these stages in the life cycle that provide a way for the pathogen to hide, right? In virus, it's latency. In bacteria, it's the endospore. In fungi, it's the spore, okay? And in helminths and protozoa, we're going to find out it's the cyst, okay? And all of these are states in the life cycle where they can wait for better conditions to roll around so that they can go ahead now and cause trouble. Okay. Asexual spores include sporangiospores that form inside a sac called a sporangium. The spores are released when the sporangium ruptures. Cnidiospores are produced at the tips or the sides of hyphae and aren't enclosed in a sac-like structure. Pinch off the tip of a fertile hypha, or you can do segmentation of a pre-existing vegetative hypha, and you'll see those spores. Cnidia have the most common of asexual spores and exist in different forms, okay? Examples, right? The arthrospore, we saw that in the previous panel, okay? A rectangular spore formed when septate hyphae break at a cross wall. The matospores are a spherical conidium produced by the thickening of the hyphal cell. Blastospore, buds from a parent. Phyalospore, buds from the mouth of a vase-shaped spore-bearing cell. Microconidium and macroconidium are spores formed by the same fungus under different conditions. Microconidium are single-celled, macroconidium are multi-celled. Okay? Porospores grow through small pores in a spore-bearing cell. Okay? Sexual reproduction introduces genetic variation wherever we see it in biology. Okay, it occurs when nutrients are limited or other unfavorable conditions are present. Mating types are usually designated as plus and minus. Fungal spores are compact and lightweight and can be dispersed widely through the environment by air, water, and other organisms, and germinate when they arrive at the good conditions. Okay, the sexual reproduction phase of fungi, unlike asexual spore formation, introduces variable characteristics. Survival of the species through genetic change is possible. Sexual reproduction of fungi can be summarized in 4 basic steps, with some differences occurring between groups. And we'll go through those in a bit, right? Different types of fungi include zygomycota, which are multinucleate molds, most of which are saprobes. They get their nutrition from non-living organic material. Others are obligate parasites of insects or other fungi. Ascomycota, primary fungus causing food spoilage. Examples of beneficial members of the group include penicillium, which produces penicillin. Basidiomycota, which include mushrooms and puffballs and have fruiting bodies. Deuteromycota, because of their sexual reproduction method being still unknown. And lichens, which are really a combination of a fungus and an algae, right? They consist of hyphae of a fungus and cyanobacteria or green algae and form a symbiotic relationship. And these are often pioneer species in what's called biological succession. So for instance, if you have a volcanic eruption, say, you wipe out everything on the surface and then you got to start from scratch, from bare rock. One of the first things that happens often is a lichen that grows there. It produces its own food because of the photosynthesis of the cyanobacteria. And then the fungus feeds off of what the algae produces for it. And then they eventually break down the rock and contribute organic material to it. And then that leads to the opportunity for the formation eventually of soil. Okay. So you can see some fleshy fungi here. Okay. This shows a typical mushroom with a cap and a stem formed by a thick mat of hyphae, collectively called a mycelia. The overall vegetative structure is called a thallus. Okay. This is a lichen growing on the side of a tree, represents a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and an algae. Let's talk about these algae. Okay. These are, again, eukaryotes. They're photosynthetic organisms, widespread in fresh and marine water. They're the main component of plankton, what we would call phytoplankton. Okay. Others are found in soil, on rocks, or on plants, and some even exist in hot springs or snowbanks. Food poisoning is caused by the toxins of marine algae, such as dinoflagellates. This overgrowth known as red tide. Marine animals feed on them and accumulate toxins from the algae, which can persist for several months. It's responsible, for instance, for shellfish poisoning in humans. Okay? Plankton are a community of free-floating microbes that can be important in the aquatic food chain. The largest animals on Earth feed on plankton. And those would be the whales, okay, the filter feeders. Shellfish poisoning of humans occurs after the consumption of toxin-exposed clam shellfish or other invertebrates. Is marked by neurological symptoms that lead to death. Cooking doesn't destroy the toxin, and there's no antidote, so you got to be careful. Some toxic algae also include Pfisteria piscicata, implicated in massive fish kills in the United States. It's often reported in fish. It's been observed in humans as well, especially in people working around waters with an abundance of the organism. Agricultural runoff promotes an increase in the growth of this pathogen. Okay? This newly identified species occurs in at least 20 forms, all of which are capable of releasing a toxin, and both fish and humans develop neurological symptoms and bloody skin lesions. All algae have two things in common. They're photosynthetic and aquatic, meaning they live in water. Okay? They're not a unified group. They differ in distribution, morphology, and reproduction and biochemical preference. Classification is problematic and hasn't been completely determined. Historically, the differences in photosynthetic pigment, storage products, and cell wall composition have been used to classify the algae into different groups according to their photosynthetic pigments, such as green algae, red algae, brown and golden algae, and yellow-green. Okay? All are capable of asexual reproduction. Unicellular algae divide by mitosis, followed by cytokinesis. Multicellular may also produce asexually by fragmentation, each fragment being capable of forming a new thallus, which is the vegetative structure, or forming filaments. Unicellular algae can also reproduce sexually. Each cell serves as a gamete. When they fuse, they make a zygote, which undergoes meiosis to return to the haploid state. Unicellular algae, when they produce sexually, each algal cell is a gamete, okay? The zygote then undergoes meiosis, and we now have haploid cells to undergo fertilization again, okay? When multicellular organisms reproduce sexually, every cell in the reproductive structure of the algae becomes a gamete. The sexual reproduction can change with asexual reproduction, okay? So sexual and asexual reproduction can alternate depending on the growth conditions. Other species can alternate generations whereby the offspring resulting from sexual reproduction reproduce asexually, and the next generation then produces sexually. So you can see examples here, right? So it can occur by what we call alternation of generations of haploid and diploid generations, okay? So you can see here with asexual reproduction, all right, we can have a single cell, right? And that can form hyphae, all right? And that can form the conidiospore, okay? Which can grow and release conidiospores, all right? And then the conidiospore germinates into a mycelium, and cytoplasmic fusion can take place, okay, with the opposite mating type, all right? And then we have a dikaryon, right, which means two nuclei. The nuclei have the diploid state. This is the zygote, right? Meiosis happens, and then we release these components of the ascus, the ascospores, and then they can do the asexual reproduction, okay? So alternation of generations. Okay. All right, let's take 15. We'll be back at 325. Okay, running through the algae. Chlorophyta, green algae, right? Pigments are chlorophyll A and B, just like you see in green plants. Most are unicellular or filamentous. They live in freshwater ponds, lakes, and pools. They form a characteristic green to yellow scum, right? They use sugar and starch as food reserves because of these and other similarities with plants. Green algae are thought to be the progenitors to plants.
It's A-L-G-A-E. Mute your mic. Mute your mic.
I got it. I got it. Let's see. Okay. Rhodophyta have a red accessory pigment. They are the red algae, and they use glycogen as their energy storing molecule. They have cell walls containing agar. They're used to make agar plates. They're a thickener for soups, jellies, and ice cream. Phaeophyta are brown algae. They have a brown pigment in addition to chlorophyll and carotene. Depending on the amount of brown pigment, Phaeophyta may appear brown, tan, yellow-brown, greenish-brown, or green. Most brown algae are marine organisms. Chrysophyta are a diverse group. Diatoms belong to it. They have unique cell walls made of silica, and they're part of plankton. Because of their massive numbers, they're the major source of the world's oxygen. Okay, that's where most of the photosynthesis takes place. There's the diatoms, look pretty interesting, right? These are the silica skeletons in Chrysophyta, okay? These are part of phytoplankton as well. Okay. All right, now we're gonna move into more complex organisms, protozoans, the slime molds, and the helminths, which are the worms, okay? Protozoans are a very broad group, okay? They're defined by three common characteristics. They're eukaryotic, they're unicellular, they don't have a cell wall, okay? Most are free living, but others can be parasites in humans and other animals. Immunocompromised people are susceptible to all opportunistic infections, even those produced by protozoans. For the most part, infections caused by protozoans are most prevalent in tropical and subtropical nations, but also occur in temperate regions. Now, why would this be? Okay, and the answer is that in a lot of tropical and subtropical regions, not only are the conditions right for the protozoan to grow, but there isn't necessarily a lot of public sanitation. Okay, often the potable water and the wastewater are the same water, right? Which means it's easy to spread disease. Okay. So these are a diverse group of microbes with the exception of one subgroup. They're motile because of cilia, flagella, and pseudopodia, okay? They vary in size. They require moist environments to survive. Most are in ponds, streams, lakes, and oceans. Others in soil, beach, sand, and decaying organic matter, okay? Most are chemoheterotrophs and get nutrients from various sources such as bacteria and decaying organic matter, eating other protozoans, okay, and host tissue. They phagocytize one or more of the following, okay? And so that's how they get their nutrients, okay? Some protozoans are photoautotrophic, such as dinoflagellates and euglenoids, okay? Meaning they can make their own food and then consume it, which is pretty cool. They can be classified as algal plants rather than protozoans, and that adds a problematic nature to their classification. We're not really quite sure where to put them, okay? Protozoans exist in a motile active feeding state called the trophozoite, and when the environment becomes unfavorable for feeding, they can enter a dormant stage called a cyst, which can be distributed by air and may play a role in transmitting diseases such as amoebic dysentery. Given the appropriate conditions, the cyst breaks open and becomes an active trophozoite. Okay, so this is another one of those parts of the life cycle where we can basically live forever, okay, if we want to, until good conditions come back around. So another example of a pathogen having sort of a way out, right? The cyst in the case of the protozoan. The life cycle ranges from simple to complex. Some are only trophozoites and others alternate between trophozoite and cyst. The main method of reproduction is asexual. Schizogony is multiple fission, where the nucleus undergoes multiple divisions before the cell divides. This is asexual reproduction, okay? And we can also see in some of these protozoans fission and budding, okay? After the formation of multiple nuclei in schizogony, small amounts of cytoplasm surround each nucleus, and the initial single cell separates into daughters. Some become parasitic species, reproducing asexually within the host by this method. A few protozoa reproduce sexually by conjugation, such as paramecium. Each cell has two nuclei, a macronucleus responsible for growth and a haploid micronucleus for conjugation. Two cells fuse, one micronucleus from each cell migrates to the other resulting in fertilization and then cell division. After this process is completed, the parent cells separate. Each is now a fertilized cell, and with later cell divisions, they'll produce daughter cells with recombinant DNA. Okay, so again, the advantage of sexual reproduction, which is more biodiversity in the population. Here we see each cell with a macronucleus responsible for growth and a haploid micronucleus. Okay, during conjugation, the two cells fuse and the micronuclei of the two cells fuse. The parent cells, now fertilized, separate and produce daughter cells with recombined DNA. Okay. Classifications of these have changed because of the contribution that we get from actually looking at DNA sequence now, right? DNA sequencing is now cheap, inexpensive, and very, very accurate, okay? Previous classifications include Sarcodina, Mysticophora, Ciliophora, and Sporozoa. Protozoans can colonize and infect different areas of the human body. Archezoa have no mitochondria and have mitosomes instead. Many are spindle-shaped with two or more flagella. Human parasites from this group include Trichomonas vaginalis and Giardia lamblia. Okay. A couple of centuries ago, Linnaeus classified protozoans as animals, but later they became their own kingdom, Protista. And some taxonomists divided the protozoa into 4 groups based on locomotion, as we noted. For a lot of applications, this grouping, according to locomotion, is still the most common because taxonomists still revise and refine the classification of protozoa on the basis of EM findings, and even more so on the basis of DNA. We're going to focus on medically important protozoa independent of their past, current, or future classification. The grouping in this text is based both on unique morphology and cell structure in the organelles. We talked about the mitosomes, right? They have been seen only in organisms that don't have mitochondria, including anaerobic or microalphylic organisms. Because these protozoa don't contain mitochondria, they can't use oxidation for energy transformation. So here you can see an example of Giardia, okay? The protozoan is equipped with flagella to provide whip-like movement through the water. Now, you have probably heard of cases of giardiasis in the tri-state, and it usually happens at public pools where mothers bring their babies in diapers to be in the pool, and that's one of the ways Giardia gets transmitted is fecal-oral, okay? Microspora don't have mitochondria. They're obligate intracellular parasites in animals, including humans. They've been reported to be the cause of several human diseases, mostly patients with AIDS, okay? So they have an immunocompromised condition, and then this little guy comes on in. Ciliophora found everywhere there's water. They're obligate opportunistic parasites and have cilia for movement. They're usually harmless, but there is a pathogen, Balantidium coli, okay? The ciliates are probably the best known and most frequently observed unicellular organisms. Euglenozoa are a large group of flagellated protozoa. They can be photoautotrophic and have an eye spot that senses light that directs the cell into the appropriate direction for photosynthesis. In fact, they're facultative chemoheterotrophs because they can also ingest organic matter, okay? Hemoflagellates are blood parasites and transmitted by the bite of insects. They have long, slender bodies and undulating membranes, giving them motility in the circulatory system of the host. The genus Trypanosoma includes Trypanosoma brucei, which is transmitted by the tsetse fly and causes sleeping sickness. Okay. Amoebozoa are the most common unicellular and common in soil and water. They have pseudopods. They move by amoeboid movement. Entamoeba histolytica produces amoebic dysentery. Naegleria fowleri produces meningioencephalitis and also is the brain-eating amoeba. Okay, you may have heard of it. Amoebas move by cytoplasmic flow, extending blunt lobe-like projections in front of the cytoplasm called pseudopods. The primary way in which the protozoans get nutrition is by phagocytosis. The cell surrounds the food particle, pulls it in, and then a lysosome fuses with it and breaks it up. Apicomplexa have a complex life cycle with different hosts. Examples include Plasmodium, which causes malaria, and Toxoplasma gondii, which causes toxoplasmosis, sorry. Apicomplexa are a large group of protozoans characterized by a unique complex organelle called the apical complex. They can be visualized only by EM, electron microscopy. So there you see your amoeba, okay, with the false feet, the pseudopods extending out. It lets it crawl over surfaces. And there's our apicomplexa with our apical complex, okay, the rhoptery and the micronemes and so on, okay. Slime molds have both fungal and amoebal characteristics. They're more closely related to amoeba than fungi. Cellular slime molds spend most of their lives as single amoeboid cells. Unfavorable conditions causes them to aggregate. Plasmodial slime molds are masses of protoplasm containing thousands of nuclei called plasmodium. Cellular slime molds are of interest to biologists because they provide a simple and easily manipulated system for understanding cellular migration and aggregation. Plasmodial slime molds distribute oxygen and nutrients throughout the plasmodium by a process called cytoplasmic streaming, where the plasmodium moves and changes its speed and direction. The plasmodium grows as long as food and moisture are available. So you can see here the reproductive cycle of the cellular slime mold there, okay? You can see at some points it looks like a vegetative body of a fungus, right? Like a basidiomycota, but then it alternates into something that looks more like an amoeba, okay? So you can see how we have, again, alternation of generations, right? We have a dizygotic or a diploid state on the right, and then we have a haploid state on the left, okay? Both sexual and asexual reproduction. The helminths are the most complicated of the organisms that we're going to run into in this course, and these are worms, okay? They're multicellular eukaryotes, and as a result, it's very difficult to find something that's going to be effective at controlling them if they produce disease, okay? They're interesting to microbiologists because parasitic helminths produce microscopic infective and diagnostic stages in their life cycle, generally eggs or larvae. They're found in blood, feces, and urine and must be distinguished from true microbes, okay? Helminths are just one of the groups of eukaryotic worms. Many parasitic helminths spend much of their life cycle in the mammalian host. Most that hit humans are either flatworms or roundworms. Adult animals are usually large enough to be seen with the naked eye, while the eggs and the larvae are microscopic. All helminths are multicellular eukaryotes that have complete body systems. They have a digestive system, circulatory and nervous system, excretory and reproductive system. Parasitic helminths can differ from their free-living counterparts because the parasites have to be highly specialized to live in their host. Generally, at some point in their life cycle, they live in the GI tract of the human, okay? The life cycle includes a fertilized egg, a larva, and an adult. They can be extremely complex, involving a succession of intermediate hosts and a final host. Larval development usually happens in the intermediate host, adulthood and mating in the definitive host. Humans are definitive hosts for a lot of parasitic worms, and the source of infection includes contaminated food, soil, water, or infected animals. The route of infection can be oral intake or skin penetration, either or, okay? We start with platyhelminthes, the flatworms. These include the trematodes, the lung fluke, the liver fluke, the blood fluke, all named by the host tissue they attack. Cestodes or tapeworms are intestinal parasites. The helminths are classed according to their shape, size, and degree of organ development, and by the presence of hooks, suckers, and other special structures, and that's how they latch onto you and do their work. In addition, the mode of reproduction, the type of host, and the shape of the eggs and the larvae can be used to classify them. Members of platyhelminthes are dorsoventrally flattened. As a result, they're called flatworms. Parasitic flatworms include trematodes and cestodes, okay? So there you see an example of a cestode, tapeworm, okay? The nematodes, or roundworms, include Enterobius vermicularis, pinworm, which spends life in the human host, and the eggs are transmitted by host or by fomite. Ascaris lumbricosoides, a human parasite without an intermediate host. Acyclostoma duodenale, which is hookworm, which likes to live in the small intestine of humans, hence the duodenum in the name, okay? Nematodes are cylindrical and tapered at each end and are the most numerous multicellular animals on the planet. They possess digestive, nervous, excretory, reproductive systems, but lack defined circulatory and respiratory systems. They're found everywhere, in freshwater, marine, and terrestrial environments. Many are free living and harmless. Others are parasitic and can be pathogens to plants and animals, including us. Nematode infections in humans are split into two categories, depending on whether the eggs or the larvae are the infectious agent. The figure shows the hookworm, which lives in the small intestine of humans. Their eggs are excreted in feces and their larvae hatch in the soil. Okay. All right. Let's break for another 15.